So now that we've seen how the history of the West is characterized by these changing economic forces of production, which then set up social conditions for class struggle, and then how these class struggles revolutionize the economy and the social structure and the superstructure, so that there's a revolution and a new set of classes arise and so forth. And we saw that history can be divided in the West between these ancient Asiatic, evolving to the feudal, and then eventually to the capitalist economy, and thus capitalism itself has the seeds for its future destruction into a classless communist society. And so what we want to do today is we want to trace in detail, as Marx does and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, how capitalism in its very arising produces the seeds of its own destruction and therefore lays up or sets up the economic conditions for a future classless society. And again, we're going to be following this general pattern, but what you have to see is the impetus behind this is always human productive forces. Human productive forces open up new possibilities for wealth and surplus, and how that surplus is distributed or hoarded is really the driving force behind all of this. So when you look at this sort of conceptual map that I've laid out for you here, you'll see that I have laid it again the way he does on a materialist substructure of technology, the forces of production, and how developments in technology produce new means of production, which then lead to new social relationships, which then set up a political structure that ossifies or stabilizes that and legitimates it. And all of this is done under the rubric of a general economic circulation or system. So we're going to look at it like that, exactly the way Marx does. And we're going to start with the height of the feudal era. Okay? So what happens is this, is of course in the feudal era, you have the setting up of towns that set up guilds to protect the skilled workers and city dwellers from the nobles, and how the nobles want to dominate everything and have everything, all of the resources under their sway. How do the nobles get their legitimacy? Well, they get it through the idea that they are given to this, but they're given this by God and through their duty to protect everyone below them. And so thus this becomes a hereditary system of exchange. And we have the first conflict occurring basically because you have wind and water allowing for the basic instruments of metal making and wheat grinding and various other things that therefore allow serfs to be free to move into the towns and start to take up different trades, manufacturing trades. And these manufacturing trades require extensive training and skill. And this skill is taken over by the guildsmaster, who determines who can rise to become from an apprentice to a journeyman to an eventual master. And it's these guilds now that become the foil, or the ones that are in conflict with the noble for resources now and control of the means of production. And of course, this all fits very well in a feudal monarchy. That is a monarchy that is highly divided among nobles in distributing the power throughout the land. And what happens is, though, is that this economic exchange then doesn't require money. The serf at the lowest level farms, produces food, which then is given to the noble and sold to the, and not sold to towns, but traded into the towns for food so that they can have supplies go back. And basically it's a reciprocal exchange of different goods. And thus it's a barter economy, a paying in kind. There's exchange going on, but it's not an exchange that does anything but emphasize the use of the various goods. And therefore, because I need this, it's useful, I will exchange this and give you something useful. But then what happens is this, is as the technology increases, so that, and as trade starts to open up with areas outside of Europe and the Middle East, and the Silk Road opens up to China, and as therefore navigation improves, the compass comes into play, trade routes are opened up, and the loom is invented, and eventually the steam engine is invented to automate a lot of processes. Then these simple crafts manufacturing turns into workshops, and the individual guilds then, with their separate skills, are brought together into these workshops under the division of labor. And so what you have is a more massive kind of manufacture that occurs that we learned about in Adam Smith, so that the individual pin now is not made at different parts or by a single person, but various people taking over various parts under a single workshop with a foreman or an owner that starts to gain money and hire laborers as a result. Well then, these manufacturers are the ones that start to develop wealth and independence from the landed nobility, the aristocracy, and the guild. And so now we have this social interplay between the manufacturer, the middle-class manufacturer in the towns, and the aristocracy and the guilds themselves, as these start to go in decline. And as a result, you have this, what is called third estate arising, that's distinct from the nobility, and that the king now can appeal to as a separate source of income to increase his power over the nobility. And as a result, you see, for example, in France, that the nobility loses its power as it gains its titles. And the height of this is under Louis the 14th, who becomes the Sun King, the centralized monarch, and thus you have a centralization of power, which is in the interest of the economic exchange, because now you have this single set of laws, not these different townships protected against each other, levying taxes against foreign goods, but all under the rubric of a single national economy, which is beneficial for trade, because that becomes the major engine of commerce. We have this increased manufacture because we have increased markets. We have foreign markets now, and so now what we need is not simple use exchange, but a new kind of value that can only come about through the monetization of the economy and the invention of exchange value. And so thus we switch from a barter economy to a foreign commerce economy. Well, technology increases. Why? Because of the profit motive now is what comes into play. You must remember that in all of these cases that we're looking at what is emphasized in each of these stages. It doesn't mean the vestiges of the guild still aren't there, that the aristocracy still isn't there. It's what comes to predominate. It's what motivations and productive forces come to take control of the course of historical development. So, what we see here is we go back down again, and now we have the industrial revolution occurring, the motive and force of creating better and better machines and automated production so that we can have what is now finally called mass production. The markets can no longer sustain the simple small businessmen or craftsmen. The feudal structures no longer can meet the demand of massive supply and demand that a world economy requires. And so thus, the invention of electricity and railroads and machines of mass production, the assembly line and the telegraph, and thus mass communication and quick communication, and therefore quick transportation require this massive output, a manufacturing economy. And thus the workshops evolve into the assembly line factories. And we then have a new social structure. The new dominant class is no longer the nobility. They've been marginalized, and now what you have is the industrial capitalist, who has now become the top rung of society, not because of position, not because of contribution in war or anything like that. All social distinctions, class distinctions are eliminated in the place of amassed wealth and capital, and thus the wealthy industrialist comes to the top, to the fore. And everyone else is marginalized or exploited for the purpose of commodity production. And thus we have the emergence of a new class of pure wage workers, ones who have no skills to speak of because they're not needed for their skills. They're simply needed to be parts of the general assembly line mechanized process to run the machines so that the mass production can take place without fail, without obstacle. Well, thus we have even the middle class manufacturers and the small businesses and workshops and skilled workers get called into question. They now come in competition with the giant industrial manufacturing firms. And so we have this new class tension that's set up between the capitalists, the wage workers, the middle class skilled workers, like for example physicians and engineers. They themselves now become wage workers who now, because of the amassing of capital under these industrial corporations and barons and industries, barons of industry, all of them require that they get paid in order to make a living. And the ones who pay them are the capitalists. So we see what Marx says is even the most skilled and sacred professions become the product of wages and the victims of the profit motive. So now, why do I become a doctor? I don't become a doctor because I want to save lives, because I feel this is something that fulfills me in work and in career. No, I want to become a doctor because doctors get paid more than factory workers. I want to become a lawyer not because I want to help society and protect the rights of those who are oppressed, but rather because lawyers get paid much more by the capitalist industrialists in the protection of their rights. And so what we see is, of course, the political situation follows that of the economic situation. Centralized nation states won't do because these nation states set up too many protective barriers in favor of national industry, in favor of local, over trade. And so what we want is we want an even playing field. We want an equalization of interests so that the economy and the market can take full functioning. And that's what we see is the development, because of the strength of the middle class, because of the strength and distribution of wealth to a wider range of property holders, democracies take in, because now these can take control and vote in the kinds of legislation they want. And thus we have a change from pure commerce to massive manufacturing industry. And of course, technology drives it all, because as technology increases, so does the automation process. The assembly line gets replaced by machines that can do without workers. And even the skilled professions now are such that you don't need as much skill to be in their place. And so, thus we have high-tech information industry. And this leads to a total automation of the manufacturing process and a need for workers that are even less skilled, and therefore a grouping of the skilled workers into the unskilled wage workers, a displacement of workers for even less skilled workers, so that even the middle class and the skilled workers get lumped into the unskilled mass of a new class, which we call the pure wage laborer, the proletariat, versus the capitalist. And so we see a greater income gap, not only because of mass industry, but because of the transfer of industry to a new type of trade called stock trade and exchange. So now you make money not through producing anything, but by trading confidence in production. And so thus you have the stock exchange, the circulation of money in order to make money, the circulation of promissory notes on the promise that they will make more money. And so thus you now have a full skill of trading for the sake of trading and investing money that will directly make more money. And thus the more money you have, the more you will make. And thus wages get outstripped by the entrepreneurial economy based on the stock exchange, and a greater income gap increases. And thus we have the situation today, the high-tech information economy leading to pretty much total automation of the industrial process, and therefore the kicking out of industrial nations of simple manufacture. That goes now to the lower stage nations, the developing nations. And now you have this pure division between service and riches. The proletariat now are those who totally are reliant on the money of the rich and do only things to make a wage. And this now becomes the era of the international corporation rather than the national industry, simply because you need to exploit new markets. The total world is now interdependent, and all national boundaries become boundaries which restrict free trade and free markets, and we must destroy them. And the circulation of money gets replaced by the circulation of confidence and information, and money now gets invested to make profit at a level that is beyond even the notion of a piece of metal or paper. All of this sets us up, Marx says, for two forces. One that the capitalist thinks they have control over, the other which they encourage, but will inevitably lead to this conflict which destroys capitalism and gives victory to the worker.